Roll for random encounter.
DeathStalker V coming to you late at night from the Fortress of Doom. Here recently, I put up a video of my early gaming stories. A few stories, just a few. And surprisingly, some people liked it. That was surprising. I even got an email, you know, from someone who plans to be on the show in the near future, and they were listening to it and enjoying it. Even Andrew in the UK, hey, he's back, and surprisingly enough, his first D&D set was the first D&D set I had, the classic D&D set, and I thought that was amazing because I was the only person who started off with this set that I had knew for a while. The classic D&D set from TSR, uh, a repackaging of the first basic set of D&D. It was done in 1994, and yeah, it wasn't the first D&D that I owned. No, that belonged to AD&D first edition. Here's one of my first books that I obtained from my friend's Jordan brother. He they sold us all their first edition stuff when we were in elementary school because second edition was hot. I guess they no longer wanted the first edition stuff, and so hey, we were happy. But we first edition, like I said in the previous video, it was a little bit beyond our comprehension level of how to play this game and fully enjoy it. But that changed with us getting that basic set. I received it for my birthday. One day we'll do a video on we'll probably review that set and really go through it in depth because it's really just an amazing set for any role playing game. And we'll take a look at a lot of box sets. I love finding old box sets of classic role playing games and seeing what they would give you in the box. But this week, I thought we would continue with the storytelling from DeathStalker V's horrid past. And we would talk about how I ended up in a Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition campaign in the late 90s, out of all places, a very rural First Baptist church. I know that well, some people, you may have enjoyed D&D in a church setting, but that was sort of the last place I would have expected to find a D&D campaign to belong to. So, as I said in the last story, my parents got divorced and I moved back to my first hometown where my grandparents lived and stuff with my mother. And I went to this little elementary school, even smaller than the first one that I went to. And these were some really country kids. I mean, collard greens aren't country as these children. This was a very rural school. So there wasn't anybody really at that school that played tabletop games, board games and stuff, sure. That's always an enjoyable thing, I think, with any group of people. But when it came to hobby games, Dungeons and Dragons, wargaming, Avalon Hill type of games, Games Workshop type of games, these weren't on the radar in this little area here for these children. And they really weren't so much so in the first school I was at. But they, for whatever reason, the high schoolers and stuff had picked up on it. But this little town didn't even have a high school or a middle school. And I went to school there, and I had made friends in the fifth grade, toward the end of the fifth grade, with a guy named Roger who lived fairly close, within a few miles of my home. And it worked. We got along. We rode the school bus together. And of course, we were going to each other's houses, and by that time, it was Super Nintendo and Sega going on still, and it was just a really fun time. And I don't know. It's we would go to each other's homes, recollect my thoughts here. I'm going down memory lane. These synapses in the brain haven't fired for a while. But his name was Roger, and like I said, he was part of a church youth group. Okay, and I had never really participated in church too heavy. I didn't come from a big church going family or too much of a religious family. They were religious, but they weren't a church going religious type of family. But he lived there, and he went to this church youth group, and he saw that I was into things like Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy and whatnot. And he said, "Man, you really got to come join our youth group at our church." And I'm like, "Why?" And he's like, "We got a new youth group leader, and he's into Star Wars, he's into science fiction stuff, and he plays Dungeons and Dragons. And yeah, it's just this awesome thing we do every week. I'm not into Dungeons and Dragons, but they play it." I said, "What else is going on there?" Like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Oh, on Friday nights, we spend a night in the basement of the church, and we all get together, and there's really no church things going on. We're not sitting around studying the Bible or anything like that. Literally, he runs for the older kids that are part of the youth group, PJ and Levi. I can remember a few of their names. They run a D&D campaign, but we also watch movies. We play video games. You can bring your consoles. We hook them up to the TV down there. We sometimes we bring more than one TV, but it's an all night thing, and I mean literally all night. And bef- in the morning around 7, there was a group of older ladies that belonged to the church, and they came in with homemade breakfast for the youth group. And I was like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah, you're gonna love it, because we all have to at 6:30. We all go and act like we're asleep, and when they come in, we act like we're waking up, and they feed us." So I'm like, "Okay, this sounds interesting. This really sounds interesting. Video games, uh, D&D, movies. Okay, I'm in. What else do we need? What else do we need?" So I go home. I convince my mother, "Hey, I want to join this church." And of course, that brought on the crazy look. And I was like, I'm serious. I want to join the church." And she's like, "Well, if you join the church, that means I got to start going." I said, "Well, I really want to go." And she's like, "Why?" I was like, "They got a youth group. Roger's in it. They have a lot of fun. I want to be part of it. I want to join in." So it didn't take much to convince her. I think she was sort of happy, because I think she was a little bit worried about me going to a new school and new kids around. And of course, Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy and that kind of thing. She never got it. She never got into it. And I think it bothered her a little bit that I was into it. But hey, you know. So vegan didn't need to happen. That I think it was probably the next Friday coming up is when they met, and she took me there and she met the youth minister. And out of all people that the youth minister was, he was his name was David. He was from up north, and he was Jewish, running the youth ministry of a Southern First Baptist church. I don't know what kind of combination happened here. It sounds like we're playing a game of riffs. And he worked for the local county government, I think, with child services or something like that. And he volunteered and worked with this youth group at the church. I think they literally had nobody to run this youth group. I mean, this town had like two churches, a Baptist and a Methodist. I'm sure some Sundays they got out and fought in the streets. I don't know. There's really nothing going on here. So he was a really needed asset to the community to come in and want to do things with the youth. So we go and we meet them, and David's this awesome guy, super nerd, you know. I'm still friends with him to this day. I'm not going to put his picture up. I don't ever want to cause harassment or people looking up people or something. I don't know. I don't know what I fear about that. But I'm still friends with him to this day. He's still a super nerd. I love talking to him on social media and whatnot. He moved back to Pittsburgh. He's a Pennsylvanian boy. But yeah, she talked to him and she dropped me off. Now the first night I was there, I really didn't know what to expect. Roger told me some details, but these are I think this was after 5th grade. I think it was the summer before going into middle school, if my memory serve. But sometimes kids can over exaggerate in different things, and so you just had to check things out for yourself. That was your best bet. And that's what I did. I showed up. David was super cool. The older teenagers that were part of the group, PJ and them, they were super cool. Really awesome. Nobody was stuck up. Nobody looked down on nobody. It was like this. I don't know. I don't. It was just a really great thing to be part of. I'll try to cut down the rambling here. So that first night, Uh, I don't remember it too well, but I do remember they broke out Dungeons and Dragons and they were playing first edition because the older kids in the youth group wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. David, you know, our Jewish Southern Baptist youth minister from Pittsburgh, he knew first edition AD&D. He had played it in college and enjoyed it and had the material and knew it back and forth. So that was that. They played first edition. They didn't play second edition. They played first edition AD&D. So I was very excited because I had always really wanted to get into AD&D, but didn't have nobody around with the know-how of AD&D because AD&D first edition, it's a lot like basic, but there's several mechanics in the system that have a finesse to them that you really need to see them in action if you've never seen it before to really get the gist of it, especially as a child. So I sat back that first night and they played AD&D until like 1 or 2 in the morning. And this thing started at 7 o'clock at night. I remember, it was 12 hours of paradise as a kid. And it was fantastic. There was no, having to sit for 3 hours studying the Bible or chanting or any cult like activity. it was it was awesome. And the kids that weren't playing AD&D, that was mostly the older teenagers. The other children, they were watching movies. They were playing the video games. I think Roger had brought his Sega Genesis. Me and Roger had the Nintendo versus Sega debate going on. Though I love both consoles dearly, I was on the Nintendo side because I had a Super Nintendo. That was the console that I owned. So you got to defend what you got, you know. But that first night was amazing. And then sure enough, around 6:30, 6:40, David looked at the clock and he's like, "Okay, everybody, assume the positions." And that's what everybody did. They laid on the floor. They broke out pillows and blankets and laid on the couches. Now a lot of kids had fallen asleep, but the rest that were still up, they broke out all the sleeping gear, and we laid there. And sure enough, it wasn't long before a group of old ladies came in to the basement with trays of all kind of food, eggs and bacon and sausage and biscuits and all these homemade goodness. And I was like, okay, I'm in. I'm in. This is the greatest thing ever. And it turned out to be one of the greatest things ever. Very fond memories. Very fond memories. Every Friday night, like clockwork, we showed up. I brought my AD&D books. David he was a fantastic dungeon master. Fantastic. And with his, I don't know, it's interesting to look at because I always thought this should be a thing. With his degree, I think it was in psychology or child development or something, and his work at the child services for the county during the week, he would incorporate things into the games that made you think about your own self in ways. And I'm sure he did that purposely. Maybe one of us was having a rough time, or maybe so he incorporated it into the game. I remember that, you know. But his campaigns were fantastic. Uh, he would bring awesome movies. Sometimes in the youth group we wouldn't do AD&D. We might do board games or whatever. But a lot of times, if he wasn't going to run Dungeons and Dragons, he would bring some of his massive movie collection over. And he must have had a massive collection. This is VHS tapes too. And Star Wars, like I said, he was a big Star Wars nut. We watched a whole lot of Star Wars. He brought one of my favorite movies, which is Willow. That may be, I think it is probably my favorite fantasy movie of all time. I love Willow. Lord of the Rings and all that stuff is great. But far as movies go and the magic of movies, Willow has always stood out to me. And we'd watch Willow, and I remember he ran for us a Willow campaign. He had developed the world and took elements of the story and the history and stuff from the movie, and we played a campaign in that world. We didn't play Willow the movie in the world, though we did meet a few of the characters from that movie. I think he said it right before the events of the child being stolen. I mean, it was, I remember that as very fond memories. But he really put his all into this youth group, you know. He put his all into it. We were doing at least once a month, we were going on like a field trip, sometime during the week. Most of the time, the Saturday after the Friday. Nobody got much sleep. I'm not sure how David functioned. He didn't get a lot of sleep. But, he took us whitewater rafting. I'd never been whitewater rafting. We went up to Tennessee, did whitewater rafting. He took us cave spelunking. That was something that we did. He took us to a Jeff Foxworthy concert or comedy show or whatever you want to call it. And also the World's Strongest Man competition where they were breaking handcuffs and things. It was great. And probably the greatest field trip we ever took. I don't know. It would be hard to beat the caves and the whitewater rafting. But Six Flags over Georgia's near Atlanta is this massive amusement park. Fantastic. Full of just crazy roller coasters and insanely good rides. And one weekend, it was like right after Halloween. And back then, the park used to close after Halloween and didn't reopen till about this time of year when it started to warm up a little bit. They closed during the winter, and I guess they did maintenance and renovated the park and stuff each year. Staff training, whatever. But, somehow, I mean, it was literally right after Halloween. They still had all the Halloween decorations up in the park. But our church finagled a way that our youth group got to come enjoy the park. We came in, it was probably around 5 or 6 p.m. The park was closed, but a few employees stayed behind, and they ran this park until like 8 the next morning with just us there. Wow. Wow, that was amazing. No lines for any rides. There's like 12 of us. No, we all went in one van. The big white Buffalo, that's what we used to call it. Our big white old, looked like it was from the early 80s Ford cargo van, or not cargo, passenger van. And it would hold like 20 people easily. But normally it was around 12 of us. Maybe a little more that night because we went to Six Flags. But yeah, we got this whole park to ourselves. Every ride was open. And basically, the employees would just follow us around. And whatever we wanted to ride, they'd go man the station and we'd get on and ride. And I remember they had a roller coaster there called the Scream Machine. And I absolutely just loved riding that roller coaster. And you could ride rides and not get off. I mean, it was just that amazing. And me and Roger, we got on the Scream Machine toward the end of this night. Nobody was falling asleep on this night too tough. And we got on the Scream Machine, and we rode it, and we rode it, and we rode it. We were like, just don't even turn it off. Just keep it going. What a fun time. I remember on the Scream Machine, we had rode it so long that up on one of the high hills, when we went up it, I realized the sun was coming over the horizon. And it just struck me as just awfully beautiful at the time. And so I looked at Roger and I'm like, man, that's beautiful. And somehow Roger had managed to fall asleep on the Scream Machine. maybe he was passed out. I don't know. But he was over there. He was completely unconscious on the scream machine. You didn't even have to ride with people beside you. He was in the car behind me. And I look back and and it just this slow ride up this hill. He's completely passed out. He's laying in the seat, And it wasn't long after that the sun came up and they packed us all up to take us back to our little town in Georgia, which was about an hour ride away, hour and a half maybe, down the interstate. And I remember we all climbed into the van and everybody was excited. And about 15 minutes into the ride, I'm riding up front with David in the passenger seat. And it was the first time I'd ever got the coveted passenger seat, shotgun. And I thought that was a little odd, why none of the older kids riding up front or anything. Then I learned, because about 15 minutes into the ride, we looked back and everybody was wiped. They were passed out. And I've always been a night owl. In my jobs and my careers and stuff, I've always wanted to work night shift. I'm a night owl with rabid vampirism. But yeah, everybody was passed out, and David just looked at me and he's like, "I'm so tired." And I'm like, "What do you want me to do? Drive?" He's like, "No, you can't drive." He was funny like that. He says, "But whatever you do, can you please stay awake and keep talking to me so we can make it back? I don't want to pull over and on the side of the road and all of us have to sleep in a parking lot or something while everybody," this was time before cell phones. He says, "while everybody goes to looking for us. You already know what kind of panic's going to ensue if we don't pull up on time." And so that's what we did. And that was a time where I sort of had David to myself, even though we were both zombified. I got to really speak to him and know him and where he was from and everything. So special moments, special moments. But yeah, I figured it'd be fun to share these stories a little while, but that's how first edition really grew on me, was in the basement of a Southern First Baptist church. You can't beat that. And yeah, I'm sure I'll have more stories to tell you guys and gals in the future. But I just had that one on my mind for whatever reason. So hope you guys enjoyed it. And this will be not a quick video. What are we, 20 minutes in? Wake up in the back. Anyways, I'm DeathStalker 5. And before I go, the picture that I put up of the First Baptist Church is the actual church. That's the actual church that we attended. And I found an old picture of myself in a book that I figured I would share so you could see my dorkiness, in the late 90s. Anyways, guys, I'm DeathStalker 5. This is the Random Counter Show. See you guys next time.
Hey, this is DeathStalker 5. If you like the Random Encounter Show, make sure you're subscribed to our channel so that you'll be the first to know when we upload a new episode. Want to support the show? Head over to Questing Table Studio on Facebook. Let us help you bring your table to life with miniature painting services and terrain.